Effective immediately. Your position as Senior Vice President will be restructured. You'll be transitioning to a support role under our new Director of Strategic Operations, David Harrison. The words landed like ice water, each syllable carefully measured to sound professional while delivering devastation. I sat motionless in the mahogany-paneled boardroom, my hands folded on the polished surface that had witnessed countless decisions I'd helped shape over 23 years. Richard Harrison, the company's founder and CEO, wouldn't meet my eyes as he delivered the news. Beside him, David Harrison, his 28-year-old son, leaned back in his chair with the casual confidence of someone who'd never had to prove himself. At 54, I was being told I was being realigned for the company's evolving needs, which everyone understood as code for something far more brutal. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across faces that had once sought my counsel. Margaret from legal twisted her pen between manicured fingers, studying the grain of the table like it held state secrets. The silence stretched until Richard cleared his throat, the sound sharp and final in the sterile air. The transition will be effective Monday. Your salary adjustment will reflect the new structure. We're looking at approximately 38% to align with market standards for the role. His voice carried the rehearsed quality of someone who'd practiced this speech in the mirror. 38%. After building their digital transformation strategy from nothing, after steering them through 3 major acquisitions, after being the person they called at midnight when crises erupted, they were cutting my salary by more than a third and placing me under someone who still asked his assistant to explain quarterly reports. I didn't flinch. 23 years in corporate warfare had taught me that showing emotion in rooms like this was like bleeding in shark-infested waters. Instead, I nodded once, the kind of measured response that gave away nothing while my mind cataloged every detail. David's smirk when his father mentioned my salary reduction. Margaret's inability to maintain eye contact. The way Richard's hand trembled slightly as he reached for his water glass. "Is there anything else?" I asked, my voice steady as granite. "Sarah will coordinate the handover details with you tomorrow morning," Richard said, referring to his executive assistant. "We appreciate your understanding during this transition period." Understanding. As if I should be grateful for being demoted by someone who couldn't distinguish between revenue and profit margin without consulting Google. As if my 2 decades of institutional knowledge was a burden they were graciously allowing me to share with their golden boy. I stood, smoothed my blazer, and walked toward the door. Behind me, I heard David's voice, pitched low but not low enough. "Finally, we need fresh perspectives, not someone stuck in the past." A few nervous chuckles followed, the kind of laughter that happens when people know they're watching something terrible but feel powerless to stop it. The hallway stretched before me like a gauntlet. Heads turned from cubicles, conversations died mid-sentence, and I felt the weight of curious stares following my measured steps. Sarah intercepted me near the elevator, her expression a careful mask of professional sympathy. "Victoria, I'm so sorry about..." "Don't." The word came out sharper than I intended. Sarah stepped back, understanding immediately. Pity was the last thing I needed, especially from someone who'd witnessed every backroom deal, every strategic pivot I'd orchestrated to keep this company solvent while Richard played golf with potential investors. The elevator doors slid open with mechanical precision, and I stepped inside, finally allowing myself a moment to breathe. 23 years. I'd joined Harrison Dynamics when it was barely more than Richard's ambitious startup, housed in a converted warehouse with folding chairs for conference rooms. I'd built their technology infrastructure from scratch, negotiated their first major contracts, and watched revenues climb from 6 figures to 9. I'd sacrificed weekends, holidays, and countless family dinners to ensure their success. And now his son, fresh from business school with theories but no practical experience, had convinced his father that my expertise was obsolete, that my methods were outdated, that the company needed to embrace a more dynamic leadership approach. Translation. They needed someone younger, more malleable, someone who wouldn't question David's half-baked strategies or point out the flaws in his revolutionary ideas that weren't actually revolutionary at all. The elevator reached the parking garage, and I walked to my car with deliberate calm. Only when I was safely inside my sedan, doors locked and windows up, did I allow my composure to crack. My hands shook as I gripped the steering wheel, and for a moment, I felt the full weight of what had just happened. But the vulnerability passed quickly, replaced by something harder and far more dangerous: clarity. That evening, I sat in my home office, surrounded by the detritus of a successful career. Awards lined the walls, commemorating achievements that suddenly felt meaningless. Photos captured moments of triumph, ribbon cuttings, contract signings, team celebrations where I stood at the center, smiling beside colleagues who'd just watched me get dismantled without saying a word. I opened my laptop and began typing, not a resignation letter or a furious email, but something far more methodical. I started documenting everything I could remember about Harrison Dynamics: operations, their vulnerabilities, their dependencies on systems and processes I'd created. 23 years of institutional knowledge doesn't simply vanish because someone decides you're past your expiration date. The irony wasn't lost on me. They thought my age made me irrelevant, but it was precisely my years of experience that gave me something David Harrison would never possess: perspective. I knew where everybody was buried, every shortcut taken, every corner cut in the name of expediency. I knew which vendors provided kickbacks, which contracts contained clauses that could trigger massive penalties, and which regulatory requirements were being met through creative interpretations rather than actual compliance. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My phone buzzed with a text from my daughter Emma. "How did the meeting go today? Call me when you get a chance." I stared at the message, remembering the pride in her voice when she'd introduced me to her colleagues as the VP who turned Harrison Dynamics into a tech powerhouse. How do you tell your child that the career you've built, the reputation you've cultivated, the respect you've earned, can all be stripped away because someone decided your birth certificate makes you a liability? Instead of calling, I texted back, "Long story, let's catch up this weekend." I returned to my laptop, opening financial reports I'd compiled over the years. Harrison Dynamics had grown exponentially, but that growth masked several concerning trends that I'd been monitoring quietly. David had been pushing aggressive expansion strategies that looked impressive on paper but created dangerous leverage ratios. He'd championed acquisitions that sounded visionary in board meetings but created integration nightmares that I'd been tasked with solving. Most concerning was his latest obsession with automating legacy systems without understanding their interconnections. He'd brought in outside consultants who promised revolutionary efficiency gains, while completely ignoring the reality that these systems had been customized over decades to handle specific client requirements. The consultants' proposals would work beautifully in a theoretical environment, but would likely create catastrophic failures in the real world. I tried to raise these concerns in recent months, but David had dismissed them as resistance to innovation and, quote, fear of change. Richard, increasingly deferential to his son's vision, had begun treating my cautions as complaints rather than professional assessments. A memory surfaced from 3 weeks earlier. I'd been in David's office, trying to explain why his proposed system migration could create data integrity issues that would violate several major client contracts. He'd been scrolling through his phone while I spoke, occasionally nodding without looking up. When I finished, he'd set his phone down and smiled with condescending patience. "Victoria, I appreciate your experience, but sometimes experience can be a hindrance. We need to think outside the box, embrace disruption, not cling to old ways of doing things, because that's how we've always done them." Quote. He gestured toward his wall, where his MBA diploma hung beside motivational posters featuring sunsets and inspirational quotes. The business world is evolving rapidly. What worked in the past isn't necessarily what will work in the future. I'd left that meeting knowing that my days were numbered, not because I was wrong, time would prove my concerns valid, but because I'd committed the unforgivable sin of challenging someone who'd never learned to distinguish between confidence and competence. Now, sitting in my home office with the sting of demotion still fresh, I began to see the situation differently. They thought they were putting me out to pasture, relegating me to a support role where my inconvenient expertise could be safely ignored. But they'd made a critical error in their calculations. They'd kept me inside the building. Over the next hour, I created a comprehensive document outlining every risk factor I'd identified, every vulnerability I'd been tracking, every potential point of failure in David's grand transformation plan. I saved multiple copies, encrypted them, and stored them in various secure locations. Not because I had a plan, not yet, but because experience had taught me that information becomes power only when it's properly preserved and strategically deployed. My phone rang, interrupting my documentation. The caller ID showed Robert Chen, my former peer who'd been promoted to Chief Operating Officer 6 months earlier. "Victoria, I just heard. I'm so sorry." His voice carried genuine regret, tinged with the discomfort of someone who'd survived a purge by staying quiet. "This is insane. You've been the backbone of this company for over 2 decades. It's a business decision, Robert, nothing personal." I kept my voice neutral, professional. Bullshit. The profanity was uncharacteristic for Robert, who prided himself on diplomatic language. "David's been gunning for you since he got here. He wants to surround himself with people who won't challenge his ideas." "And how's that working out for the company?" A long pause. "You know how it's working out." Half the senior staff is walking on eggshells, afraid to contradict him. The other half has been replaced by consultants who tell him what he wants to hear. "Then you'll be fine," I said, unable to keep the edge from my voice. "You've mastered the art of agreeable silence." Another pause, longer this time. "I deserved that. But Victoria, for what it's worth, some of us tried to push back on this decision. Richard wouldn't listen. He's completely under David's influence now." "I appreciate the support, Robert, truly, but what's done is done." After hanging up, I sat in the growing darkness, processing the conversation. Robert's call had been well-intentioned, but it highlighted something important. I wasn't the only person who'd recognized the problems with David's leadership. The difference was that others had chosen to accommodate rather than confront, to survive rather than resist. That was their choice, and I didn't judge them for it. Corporate politics required different strategies for different people. Some survived by blending in, others by aligning with power, still others by making themselves indispensable through specialized skills. But I'd built my career on a different foundation, competence backed by courage. I'd succeeded because I was willing to deliver difficult truths, to challenge flawed assumptions, to stand firm when convenience demanded compromise. That approach had made me valuable for 23 years. It had also made me a threat. I opened a new document and began writing, but this wasn't another analysis or report. This was something more personal, more honest. I wrote about watching a company I'd helped build slowly poisoned by nepotism and ego. I wrote about the frustration of seeing strategic mistakes dismissed as innovation, about watching experienced professionals marginalized in favor of inexperienced enthusiasm. Most importantly, I wrote about the moment I'd realized that my age wasn't actually my weakness. It was my advantage. David Harrison saw my 54 years as a liability, evidence of outdated thinking and inflexible methods. But those years represented something he couldn't understand. Pattern recognition earned through experience, wisdom gained through failures as well as successes, and the kind of institutional memory that reveals the difference between genuine innovation and recycled mistakes dressed up in new terminology. He'd spent his entire career in classrooms and conference rooms, learning about business from people who taught theory rather than practiced reality. I'd spent mine in the trenches, solving real problems with real consequences, building systems that actually worked rather than systems that looked good in presentations. The demotion hurt. I wasn't going to pretend otherwise. But it had also clarified something I'd been reluctant to acknowledge. Harrison Dynamics had outgrown Richard's leadership and was being actively damaged by David's inexperience. They needed someone with the vision to see beyond quarterly reports and the courage to make difficult decisions based on long-term sustainability rather than short-term optics. They needed someone exactly like me. I closed my laptop and walked to the kitchen, where I poured myself a glass of wine and stood by the window overlooking my garden. Tomorrow I would begin my new role as David Harrison's subordinate. I would attend his meetings, support his initiatives, and watch him implement strategies that I knew would create serious problems for the company I'd spent decades building. But I would also be watching, learning, and documenting. Because while David thought he'd neutralized a threat, he'd actually positioned his biggest critic to have front-row seats to his inevitable failures. And when those failures began to mount, when the board started asking difficult questions, when clients began expressing concerns about service disruptions and strategic missteps, I would be ready. Not with sabotage or subterfuge, but with something far more powerful: competence, documentation, and the kind of strategic patience that only comes with age and experience. They thought they'd put me out to pasture. Instead, they'd given me the perfect vantage point to watch their house of cards collapse, and to be ready with architectural plans for something better when the rebuilding began. The wine tasted like possibilities. Monday morning arrived with the weight of inevitability. I walked through the glass doors of Harrison Dynamics at exactly 8 o'clock, the same time I'd arrived every day for 23 years. But everything felt different now. The marble lobby that once represented achievement now felt like a monument to someone else's vision. The security guard nodded respectfully, unaware that the woman he was greeting had been systematically dismantled just 3 days earlier. David Harrison was already in what used to be my office, feet propped on the mahogany desk I'd chosen 12 years ago during the company's first major renovation. He was speaking loudly into his phone, gesturing with the kind of animated confidence that comes from never having faced real consequences. Through the glass walls, I could see him pointing at papers scattered across the surface, his tie loosened despite the early hour. Sarah intercepted me before I could reach the door. "Victoria, your new workspace is ready." She gestured toward a cubicle that had been hastily assembled in what was previously a storage area near the copy machines. The symbolism wasn't subtle. From corner office to forgotten corner, from executive suite to clerical afterthought. I set my briefcase on the narrow desk and surveyed my new domain: a basic computer, a phone that looked like it belonged in a museum, and a view of the supply closet. 23 years of building an empire had been reduced to this: 4 fabric walls and a desktop that barely had room for a coffee cup. David emerged from his office, my former office, with the swagger of someone who'd just conquered territory rather than inherited it. He approached my cubicle with a smile that never reached his eyes, clipboard in hand like a manager at a retail chain. "Victoria, great to have you on the support team. I've got your first assignment right here." He dropped a stack of papers on my desk with casual authority. "Client satisfaction surveys need to be compiled and analyzed. I need a comprehensive report by Thursday." I looked at the stack. Easily 3 days of mindless data entry disguised as analysis. The kind of work typically assigned to recent college graduates or temp workers, not someone who'd designed the client satisfaction metrics he wanted me to compile. "These are the surveys from our enterprise clients?" I asked, recognizing several company names that I'd personally brought into the Harrison Dynamics family. "Exactly. Fresh eyes on the data, you know? Sometimes experience can create blind spots." He paused, letting the insult settle. "I want to see patterns that might not be obvious to someone who's too close to the historical context." The historical context he was dismissing included my personal relationships with most of these clients, my understanding of their industry challenges, and my knowledge of how their satisfaction levels correlated with specific service delivery changes we'd implemented over the years. But explaining that would require him to acknowledge expertise he'd already decided was obsolete. "Of course," I replied, my voice steady. "I'll get started immediately." As David walked away, I opened the first survey and smiled grimly. These weren't random client feedback forms. They were responses to a satisfaction assessment I'd designed and implemented 2 years earlier. I'd created the questions, established the scoring methodology, and built the analytical framework that turned raw responses into actionable business intelligence. He wanted me to analyze my own work as if I were encountering it for the first time. The irony would have been amusing if it weren't so insulting. I began reading through responses, but not with the mindless data entry approach David expected. Instead, I was looking for patterns he couldn't see, trends that revealed deeper issues with the company's direction. What I found was troubling but not surprising. Client satisfaction scores had been declining steadily over the past 6 months, coinciding exactly with David's increased influence over strategic decisions. But the decline wasn't random. It was concentrated in specific service areas where David had implemented his efficiency improvements and modernization initiatives. Enterprise clients were expressing frustration with response times, communication gaps, and what one survey described as a noticeable shift from personalized service to automated solutions that don't address our unique requirements. Another client had written a detailed comment about how their account managers seemed to lack understanding of their industry-specific needs, a problem that hadn't existed. Most revealing was a pattern in the open-ended feedback sections. Clients repeatedly mentioned missing the level of strategic insight and proactive problem-solving we've come to expect from Harrison Dynamics. They weren't just buying services from us. They were buying expertise, experience, and the kind of strategic partnership that only comes from deep understanding of their business challenges. David's efficiency improvements had eliminated exactly those elements that our clients valued most: the human expertise, the institutional knowledge, and the strategic perspective that justified our premium pricing. I spent the morning documenting these patterns, but I also did something else. I cross-referenced the declining satisfaction scores with client retention data, revenue per client, and contract renewal rates. The picture that emerged was stark. We weren't just losing client satisfaction, we were beginning to lose clients entirely. 3 major enterprise contracts were scheduled for renewal in the next 4 months. Based on their survey responses and my knowledge of their decision-making processes, at least 2 were at serious risk of non-renewal. The revenue impact would be catastrophic, nearly 15% of our annual income. But David wouldn't see this pattern because he was analyzing data without context, looking at numbers without understanding the relationships that created them. To him, a survey was just a survey, a score was just a score, and declining numbers were problems to be solved with more automation and efficiency measures. By lunch, I'd completed what should have been 3 days of work, but I'd also uncovered something more valuable: a comprehensive picture of how David's leadership was quietly dismantling the competitive advantages that had made Harrison Dynamics successful. I walked to the break room for coffee and encountered Jennifer Walsh, one of our senior account managers. Jennifer had been with the company for 8 years, long enough to remember when client relationships were built on trust and expertise, rather than automated systems and scripted responses. "Victoria, I heard about the restructuring. I'm sorry." Jennifer's voice carried genuine sympathy mixed with frustration. "Things have been challenging lately." "How so?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew. Jennifer glanced around to ensure we were alone. "The clients are noticing changes. Mrs. Patterson from Consolidated Industries called me directly yesterday asking if you were still with the company. She's been working with us for 6 years, and she specifically requested strategic consultation for their expansion project. When I told her those services were being restructured, she got very quiet." "What kind of restructuring?" "David's new policy. All strategic consulting has to go through him personally. He says it ensures consistency and prevents mixed messages." Jennifer's expressions suggested what she thought of this policy. "But he doesn't have time to actually provide the consulting, so mostly we're just telling clients that we'll get back to them." The implications hit me immediately. Our most valuable clients weren't just buying our services. They were buying access to strategic expertise that helped them solve complex business problems. If David was creating bottlenecks in that process while simultaneously lacking the expertise to deliver what clients needed, we were essentially advertising our inability to provide what we'd promised. "How are the account managers handling this?" I asked. "We're improvising mostly, trying to provide what support we can without stepping on David's authority. But it's not sustainable." Sarah Morrison quit last week, said she couldn't continue making promises to clients that she wasn't allowed to keep. Sarah Morrison had been one of our most effective account managers, someone who'd built strong relationships with clients in the manufacturing sector. Her departure represented not just lost expertise, but damaged client relationships and potential revenue loss. I returned to my cubicle with a clearer understanding of how David's leadership was creating systemic problems throughout the organization. The client satisfaction surveys were just symptoms of a deeper issue. He was dismantling the very systems and relationships that generated the revenue he was claiming to optimize. That afternoon, David appeared at my cubicle again, this time with Robert Chen in tow. Robert looked uncomfortable, avoiding eye contact while David radiated the aggressive cheerfulness of someone announcing bad news with a smile. "Victoria, I've been reviewing your progress on the survey analysis, and I'm concerned about efficiency." David held a printout of my work, though I noticed he hadn't actually read past the first page. "This level of detail isn't necessary for what I need. I'm looking for high-level insights, not exhaustive documentation." The printout in his hand contained exactly the high-level insights he claimed to want. But it also included the supporting data and contextual analysis that made those insights meaningful. Apparently, thoroughness was now considered inefficiency. "I can certainly adjust the format," I replied evenly. "What specific format would you prefer?" "Something more like a dashboard. Key metrics, trending data, maybe some charts. Clean, simple, actionable." He gestured vaguely, the way people do when they want something but don't actually know what that something is. "Dashboard format would eliminate the contextual analysis that explains why the metrics are changing," I said carefully. "Without that context, the trends won't be actionable." David's smile sharpened. "Victoria, I appreciate your attention to detail, but sometimes we need to prioritize speed over perfection. Our clients want rapid response times, not academic dissertations." Robert shifted uncomfortably beside him. As Chief Operating Officer, Robert understood the difference between rapid response and incomplete analysis. He also knew that our clients specifically paid premium rates for the kind of comprehensive analysis David was dismissing as academic excess. "Of course," I said. "I'll prepare a dashboard version by tomorrow morning." After they left, I sat staring at my computer screen, processing what had just happened. David wasn't just asking for a different format. He was systematically removing depth and expertise from every process he touched. He was transforming strategic analysis into superficial reporting, comprehensive consultation into quick responses, and institutional knowledge into automated systems. He was essentially trying to turn Harrison Dynamics into a commodity service provider while maintaining premium pricing based on expertise he was actively eliminating. That evening, I worked late in my cubicle, long after most of the office had emptied. I wasn't just creating David's simplified dashboard. I was building something far more comprehensive. Using my administrative access to historical data, I began constructing a detailed analysis of how company performance had changed since David's arrival. The patterns were undeniable. Client satisfaction wasn't the only metric declining. Employee retention was dropping, project completion times were increasing, and several key performance indicators were trending in the wrong direction. Most concerning was the pattern in contract renewals. Our retention rate had dropped from 92% to 78% in just 6 months. But David wouldn't see these patterns because he was focused on metrics that looked good in monthly reports, rather than indicators that predicted long-term sustainability. Revenue was still strong because we were operating on contracts signed months or years earlier. The impact of his changes wouldn't show up in financial reports for several quarters, by which time the damage would be severe and potentially irreversible. I encrypted my analysis and stored it securely, then created the simplified dashboard David had requested. 2 documents, telling 2 very different stories about the same company. The next morning, I presented the dashboard to David in his office. He reviewed it quickly, nodding with satisfaction at the clean formatting and straightforward metrics. "This is exactly what I needed," he said, setting the papers aside. "See how much more effective this is? Clear, concise, actionable." "The client satisfaction trend is declining," I pointed out, gesturing to the chart that showed a steady downward slope over 6 months. "Minor fluctuations," David waved dismissively. "Probably seasonal variations or temporary adjustment issues. Nothing we can't address with improved process efficiency." I watched him minimize a problem that represented millions of dollars in potential revenue loss, reducing it to seasonal fluctuations that didn't actually exist in our industry. His confidence was absolute and completely detached from reality. Over the following weeks, I settled into a routine that would have seemed impossible a month earlier. Days spent in my cubicle, completing administrative tasks that required a fraction of my capabilities. Evenings spent analyzing data that revealed increasingly serious problems with company performance. But I also began to notice something else. Other employees were seeking me out. Jennifer Walsh started stopping by my cubicle with questions about client relationships. Tom Bradley from the IT department asked for advice about system integration issues that David's consulting team was creating. Even some of the newer employees began approaching me when they needed guidance that wasn't available through official channels. They were creating an informal network around expertise that David had officially marginalized. Without planning or coordination, people throughout the company were recognizing that institutional knowledge couldn't simply be dismissed or replaced with automated systems. The breaking point came on a Thursday morning in late October. I arrived at my cubicle to find David pacing near the conference room, his usual confidence replaced by barely controlled panic. Through the glass walls, I could see Richard Harrison seated at the conference table with 3 people I didn't recognize, all wearing the serious expressions of individuals delivering bad news. Sarah hurried past my cubicle, arms full of financial reports and legal documents. The energy in the office had shifted from routine productivity to crisis management, with people speaking in hushed tones and moving with urgent purpose. I continued working on my assigned tasks, but I was also listening, observing, and piecing together fragments of conversations that painted a clear picture. Consolidated Industries had terminated their contract effective immediately. Morrison Manufacturing was declining to renew. Patterson Group was demanding a meeting with senior leadership to discuss serious concerns about service delivery standards. The client satisfaction problems I'd identified in the survey analysis weren't theoretical anymore. They were becoming financial realities that demanded immediate attention. Around noon, Robert Chen appeared at my cubicle, his expression grim. "Victoria, can we talk? Privately?" We walked to an empty conference room, where Robert closed the door and turned to face me with the expression of someone about to ask for help he wasn't sure he deserved. "We're hemorrhaging clients," he said without preamble. 3 major contracts gone in 2 weeks, 4 more threatening to leave. Richard is asking questions David can't answer, and the board is scheduling an emergency meeting for Monday. I waited, knowing there was more. David's blaming external market conditions, increased competition, temporary adjustment challenges. But the timeline correlates exactly with his strategic changes, and everyone knows it. Robert paused, studying my expression. "Richard asked me to find out if you'd be willing to consult on client retention strategies. Unofficially, of course." The irony was perfect. They'd demoted me for being outdated, and now they wanted my outdated expertise to solve problems created by their modern approach. "What kind of consulting?" I asked. "Analysis of why we're losing clients. Recommendations for retention strategies. Maybe some direct outreach to clients who are threatening to leave." Robert looked uncomfortable, asking, "Richard specifically requested your involvement. He said you built most of these relationships personally. And David's position on this consulting arrangement?" Robert's silence was answer enough. "I'll need complete access to client files, performance data, and communication records," I said finally. "If you want actual solutions rather than comfortable theories, I'll need to see everything." "Done." Richard authorized full access. Robert seemed relieved. "How quickly can you put together an assessment?" "I already have," I replied, enjoying the surprise on his face. "I've been tracking these patterns since the client satisfaction surveys David assigned me to analyze." The analysis he wanted was incomplete, but the analysis that was needed has been ongoing. That afternoon, I compiled 6 weeks of documentation into a comprehensive report that told a story David had been too inexperienced to see and too arrogant to anticipate. The client retention crisis wasn't sudden. It was the predictable result of systematically dismantling the relationship-based service model that had differentiated Harrison Dynamics from its competitors. The report included specific recommendations for immediate intervention, long-term strategic adjustments, and a framework for rebuilding the client relationships that David's efficiency measures had damaged. But it also included something more: a detailed implementation plan that could stabilize the company's position and potentially recover some of the lost contracts. Friday evening, I received an email from Richard Harrison requesting a meeting Monday morning before the board session. The subject line read simply, "Strategic Consultation." As I drove home that evening, I reflected on the strange trajectory of the past 2 months. I'd been demoted for being past my prime. relegated to administrative tasks because my experience was considered obsolete. But experience, it turned out, was exactly what the company needed, when inexperience created crises that required institutional knowledge to resolve. David had spent months positioning himself as the future of Harrison Dynamics, the visionary leader who would modernize outdated systems and transform company culture. But vision without experience is just speculation, and transformation without understanding is just destruction. Monday morning would bring a board meeting where hard questions would be asked and concrete answers would be demanded. David would be expected to explain why his revolutionary strategies had produced revolutionary problems, and why his efficiency improvements had efficiently damaged the company's most important relationships. I would be there too, not as the obsolete executive they'd marginalized, but as the consultant they'd desperately recruited to solve problems their modern leadership had created. The circle was completing itself, and this time, experience would be valued precisely because it had been so thoroughly dismissed. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.